Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. This week, Senator Lindsey Graham's Judiciary Committee held hearings on the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. We talk with Kirk Randazzo of USC for more about how those hearings went. Also, we speak with Gibbs Knotts. He's a professor of political science at the College of Charleston to hear about the record-breaking fundraising going on in the U.S. Senate race. Now more from This Week. Days ago, the World Food Program, run by former Governor David Beasley, won the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize.
For its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas.
Beasley received word of the award while traveling for the WFP in Niger.
And it's because of the WFP family. They're out there in the most difficult, complex places in the world, whether it's war, conflict, climate extremes, it doesn't matter. They're out there and they deserve this award. And wow.
At the start of the week, the Supreme Court confirmation hearings of Judge Amy Coney Barrett got underway, with questioning concluding on Wednesday in Senator Lindsey Graham's Judiciary Committee. The hearings had a cordial tone in the socially distanced committee room. Republicans like Graham heralded Barrett's pro-life views, while Democrats weren't able to get Barrett to make open declarations about her beliefs, rather saying that they won't influence her ability to interpret and apply the law in the originalism and textualism interpretation methodologies she subscribes to.
But I want to be careful to say that if I'm confirmed, you would not be getting Justice Scalia, you would be getting Justice Barrett. And that's so because originalists don't always agree, and neither do textualists.
Graham even mentioned during the hearing about the record-breaking fundraising of his opponent. Democrat Jamie Harrison shattered records with $57 million raised in the third quarter alone, something no Senate candidate has ever done before. Graham raised just under half of that at $28 million, a Senate GOP record. Meanwhile, thousands of people continued to cast in-person and mail-in absentee ballots during the second week of voting. We spoke to some voters in Jasper County.
I voted for Donald Trump because I think it takes a businessman to make the economy better, and I like what he's done so far. I'd like to see everyone just kind of move forward and give the man an actual chance if he gets 4 more years.
The country's in great turmoil. It needs to be a reckoning. It needs to be a coming together of both parties for the benefit of the people of the United States.
You know, a lot of people don't like his mouth. I do, because he doesn't take anything like somebody else would. He stands up to everybody, and he tells the way is straight out. That's my personal opinion.
As the second week of voting comes to a close, more than 358,000 absentee ballots have been cast, putting the state on track to shatter its 2016 record of 503,000 ballots cast absentee. And now to discuss the latest on the confirmation hearings of Judge Amy Coney Barrett and the state of play for the Senate race, I'm joined by Kirk Randazzo. He's an expert on judicial politics and the chairman of the political science department at the University of South Carolina. Professor, welcome back.
Thank you for the invitation. Appreciate being here.
So, Professor, we're taping on Thursday morning. All the questioning of Judge Amy Coney Barrett has already taken place by the senators. There were a lot of attempts to try and pin her down on multiple topics, multiple hot-button issues. I want to get your opinion on what you saw this week, and if we really got any insight further on what she stands for, what she believes, whether personally or, on the bench.
Yeah, I think what we saw this week is exactly what everybody expected going into this. Like you said, Democratic senators were going to try and pin her down on particular topics, potential cases, and she was going to be as evasive as possible. And I think she did a remarkable job at dodging questions she did not want to answer. But I think at the end of the day, we didn't really learn anything new. And that just means that everyone's sort of suspicions about her temperament, her judicial philosophy, and more importantly, how her appointment might change the Supreme Court, I think those suspicions are still out there.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to these hearings, if we're never going to really get to the meat of some of these things with these judges, I mean, she's not the only one to have done this, to kind of not really show her hand too much. It's kind of what they need to do. They're kind of protected in some respects. So what's the purpose of these hearings, I guess, when it comes down to it, if we're not going to get really into some of their thoughts?
Well, it's somewhat unfortunate that Judge Barrett and some others before her have invoked Ruth Bader Ginsburg and this so-called Ginsburg rule about not commenting on issues. What Ginsburg actually refused to discuss were cases that had already been appealed to the Supreme Court, and senators were trying to pin down how she might rule on those specific appeals. Ginsburg was actually very revealing about her overall judicial philosophy, how she felt about precedent, how she felt about issues that didn't have any pending litigation. And appointees or nominees since her have kind of taken those words out of context and sort of taken things to an extreme. And right now, I think we have basically confirmation hearings that look more like a show or a circus kind of act than anything designed to reveal matters of substance.
Hmm. I mean, I guess we maybe even get some insight on their temperament at least. Do we even get any of that, or did anything stand out to you of note this week?
Yeah, I think we got well, depending on how you may want to phrase it, we either got more or less information about her temperament than, say, Brett Kavanaugh. I mean, we saw in the Kavanaugh confirmation that his temper flew and was released relatively easily. Judge Barrett is much more measured in her response, much more calculating and strategic in terms not just of what she says, but how she says things. And so whether this is the approach that she would use if confirmed to the court, I think it's probably relatively safe to say that answer is yes. But where I think, again, the concerns may lay involve her judicial philosophy, this notion of originalism, and what that might actually mean for individual rights.
Mm-hmm. And one of her biggest proponents, obviously, Senate Judiciary Chairman Lindsey Graham, our state senator, big cheerleader there, really wanted to make sure this went through. We are going through. It sounds like they'll have a confirmation vote next week. What are your thoughts on how he handled this process and maybe some comments we heard from him? You know, he was even trying to interject some South Carolina politics in there when we're talking about the Affordable Care Act, when he was even brought up the fundraising by his opponent, Jamie Harrison, which was kind of odd because it didn't really have much to do. I don't think they were talking about Citizens United, but that's always right there too. What were your thoughts on how Senator Graham handled this whole confirmation process?
There were times that Senator Graham had some comments that were a bit confusing for me. One, right off the bat, he tried to sort of replay some recent history, and he lamented at the fact that these confirmations used to be bipartisan, that Ginsburg herself received 97 votes, that Scalia's confirmation was unanimous, and he tried to use that as a way to sort of lament at the current state of affairs, not necessarily realizing that the current state of affairs is really the result of some brazenly partisan politics being played by members of the Senate from both parties, not just from Republicans, although the Republicans, I think, they're the current majority, and I think they bear responsibility for the current situation. But some of the other aspects that Graham tried to bring up that weren't necessarily related to Judge Barrett, like the Affordable Care Act and the fact that South Carolina is not getting money, but the states of California, Texas, and New York are getting a vast share of money. To then have another senator come back and say, well, that's because South Carolina decided not to opt in to the Medicaid expansion. I think Lindsey has been bringing some anecdotes into this process that are probably best left alone. And that doesn't even mention the gaffe that he had yesterday when he was talking about the good old days of segregation, even though I think he meant that tongue in cheek and was very sarcastic. Given the current environment and the the political protests that have been going on, those comments, as sarcastic as they might be, sound incredibly tone deaf to people who are struggling for, you know, some kind of recognition of their rights. And I'm surprised that Senator Graham sort of went down those paths.
Yeah, and you're talking about that comment he made, like you said, sarcastically. That's what he says it was, even though it was really pretty straightforward. We know him to be sarcastic, of course, but that also came after, you know, last week during that forum was a debate turned into a forum when he mentioned about, you know, if you're black and conservative, you can go anywhere. It was a longer statement. Obviously, that was about 7 seconds, about a minute 40 long discussion about, you know, conservatism and being black and in South Carolina and the nation. But that was the clip that stuck, just like this is the clip that is sticking too. And I'm assuming that Jamie Harrison's just going to, again, raise more money off of this. You know, we've been seeing him be able to use these viral moments to his advantage. And, you know, again, this is something that has garnered millions of views, thousands of tweets and relikes and likes. So I'm just wondering, you know, did this campaigning effort, you know, this attempt to try and campaign at the same time as hold these hearings, it seems like it's backfired a little bit if this is going to be the biggest takeaway at the moment.
Yeah, you know, and this was something that we talked about when we had our conversation previously. The fact that we're holding these confirmation hearings in the middle of a campaign, you know, first of all, this part is unprecedented. We've had situations, actually over a dozen, where vacancies have occurred in an election year and a confirmation has gone through. But prior to Judge Barrett's nomination, none of those confirmations have ever happened past July. And so here we are now in October, just a couple weeks away from Election Day, and everybody, Lindsey Graham included, really should be out on the campaign trail, not necessarily in a Senate chamber doing a confirmation. And as you see, his words are being used against him. And in a campaign, whenever you can get your opponent's words to speak for themselves in a way that puts your opponent in a bad light, that's really political gold right there. And I think Jamie Harrison has been very smart, very savvy, very quick to jump on those moments. And here's yet another one that Lindsey just added to that pile.
Yeah, and we already saw that with his previous statements on, you know, court appointments during election years as well. Hold me to my words, hold me to it, stop the tape.
Mark my words, exactly.
And Professor, we have less than a minute left. I want to get your thoughts on just where this process goes from here at this point. You know, we don't have judicial filibusters anymore after 2017. What's it going to be like? We have a vote scheduled for the 22nd. What do you see going forward? Can Democrats do anything to try and hold this up? You know, we're less than 3 weeks away from Election Day. How do you see this all going forward?
So, you know, as far as, excuse me, as far as any procedural maneuvers available to the Democrats, there really aren't many. About the only trick that they might be able to play is to simply not show up for any of the votes and hope that some Republicans, maybe ones that have tested positive for COVID-19, also can't be there. Or, you know, a couple other Republican senators like Collins and Murkowski who have said that they would vote no, that maybe that would be enough to not have a quorum, or at least not have a majority that would be present in order to vote for Judge Barrett. But absent something like that, there's really nothing that the Democrats can do to prevent this. The only thing we have to do is let Senate procedure play out, and there has to be a certain amount of time allotted before some vote comes up or before a motion comes up, and then debate before the vote can come up. Those are really the only processes that are left to play out.
So it looks like smooth sailing from here then.
Pretty much. Gotcha. Yeah, I think so.
Well, thank you very much, Kirk Randazzo. He is an expert on judicial politics and chairman of the political science department at the University of South Carolina. Thanks again.
Thank you.
The Senate race between Senator Lindsey Graham and Democratic challenger Jamie Harrison continues to break fundraising records. And to discuss this, I'm joined by Gibbs Knotts. He's a professor of political science at the College of Charleston to discuss these fundraising records and, of course, the state of play with this race right now. Gibbs, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Gavin.
So we're looking at these numbers. They're astronomical. I mean, we're looking at $57 million from Jamie Harrison in the third quarter. Senator Graham raised a little bit less than half of that at $28 million. What is your take when you see these numbers? What does that mean about this race and just how important it is?
I mean, I knew this was going to be a race that got some attention, but nowhere in my wildest dreams did I expect this type of money coming in, especially for a Democrat. I mean, this is not California, this is not New York, this is South Carolina, and we've got some solid media markets in Columbia and Greenville and Charleston, but again, nothing like some of these larger states, and so it's mind blowing that there's been this much money raised. I mean, that one quarter, $57 million for Harrison is just, unbelievable that there's that much money in this race.
And when we talk about media markets, it's not like we're the most expensive media markets. Everyone's talking about Beto O'Rourke when he was raising, such high sums for the Senate race in Texas. And then you're talking about multiple major media markets in Texas, whereas we're talking about here in South Carolina where, Charleston, Columbia, Greenville, Spartanburg. So we are seeing that he is spending that money, according to FEC. He has about $8 million on hand going into this last quarter here, Jamie Harrison does. So it's going out the door pretty quick, too.
Yeah, it is. And, certainly social media is another thing. Obviously, whether you click on a YouTube video, watch a news story, anything you do in social media, you're going to see something political. And a lot of it's going to be Jamie Harrison or Lindsey Graham. I mean, Jamie Harrison is all over social media as well.
Mm-hmm. And then, Gibbs, when we look at that, the spending, do you think that it is a disadvantage? I mean, you hear from Senator Graham saying, oh, this money is coming from out of state. This is coming from people, in California, New York, these, the radical left trying to defeat me. Obviously, these people can't vote in South Carolina, so it's a little bit of a different momentum there when we talk about money versus the polling. But is that a negative, or do you think it's just a matter of just how nationalized this race has become, and it's more of a referendum on Lindsey Graham, who people have seen through the Kavanaugh hearings and his evolution on Donald Trump over the years?
I mean, I think it's a good campaign tactic for Lindsey Graham to say it's a disadvantage and to point it out. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think if you have the money, you take it. I mean, look, I think the proof is in the pudding. The polls have been close. The fact that a Democrat is within striking distance in a red state like South Carolina shows what money can do. It's a tribute to the Jamie Harrison campaign. It's a tribute to his candidacy, how compelling he is in his personal story. But I mean, look, the underlying fundamentals in South Carolina help out the Republican Party. Every statewide elected official is a Republican right now. And so, look, I don't think the closeness of this race would have been possible without these resources. It's given Harrison the ability to go out on television, tell his story, and make sure people know who he is. I mean, he had not run for office before. He'd been head of the South Carolina Democratic Party, but he was not a household name in the way that Tim Scott or Nikki Haley or even Mark Sanford was. So I do think that it's really helped him. And I certainly, he's better off for it, even if it has come largely from out of state.
And we don't even know how much money he's raised in this final quarter. We won't know that for some time after Election Day. But we have seen, big moments for Jamie Harrison because he's able to capitalize. That first debate with that plexiglass partition, that got, traction all over. Then you'd hear some responses from Senator Graham, most recently in their last debate, Turn to Forum, talking about race, and that kind of got a little convoluted, a 7-second clip there, saying that if you're black and you're conservative, you can go anywhere. That one national. I mean, all these moments that Jamie keeps kind of, capitalizing on to his advantage. It's just interesting to see how that narrative is playing out. And you would think that maybe, for Senator Graham running for a fourth term, this seems like a very precarious situation he's been in, considering the challenges he's seen over the past.
Yeah, and I think it all goes back to the decision that he made. Once Trump got elected, he seemed to shift to the right. He obviously went from being a harsh critic of Donald Trump to, a close ally of the president. And again, I think that helped Lindsey Graham fend off primary challenges. I mean, I think Lindsey Graham, during a lot of his career, he was always worried, who's going to challenge him in a primary, who's going to run to his right, who's going to say that Senator Graham's not conservative enough. No one's saying that anymore. Obviously, he coasted through the primary, but he opened himself a little bit in the general election. What he probably never anticipated was somebody raising the kind of money that Jamie Harrison's raising, and he never anticipated, it being this close. He always had a general election cushion. I still think, this is a state that's still a race that still probably leans Republican. You know, I sort of think, is it a toss-up or is it leans Republican? It's like toss-up / leans Republican. It's probably right between those. But I do think Lindsey Graham is getting all he can handle. You know, I think it's probably very surprising to him that he's in such a competitive race. The 4th time he's running for Senate, and he was in the U.S. House before that, and so he has a long history in South Carolina politics. But this is certainly going to be his closest election.
And Gibbs, when we look at it being a close election, you know, he won by 17 points, and you know, back in 2014, obviously things have changed since then in the state and the country and politics as on a whole. But I'm wondering, you know, what is maybe a narrow path to victory when we look at this? Are we talking about squishiness with some of his previous supporters? Are we looking at, you know, the fact that Bill Bledsoe, who was a Constitution Party candidate, who is no longer running but is still technically on the ballot, so people can vote for him if he wants a little bit more conservative candidate there? You know, that could peel off a couple of percentage points there. I mean, what could hypothetically happen here if we look at some of these numbers?
I mean, I look at the South Carolina 1st Congressional District with Joe Cunningham back in 2018. I mean, I think that's a model, that's a formula that Harrison could pull together. Now, one of the big differences is Graham's an incumbent, and Joe Cunningham was running against Katie Arrington, who was not an incumbent. She had knocked off Mark Sanford. But, you know, Joe Cunningham is able to win among college-educated folks, people living in the suburbs, but also get strong and solid support from the African-American community as well. And so Jamie Harrison has to start with the base of the Democratic Party, African-American voters in South Carolina, and then add to that. And he's got to be able to win some of these suburban areas. He's got to be able to win Mount Pleasant and Daniel Island and, you know, some places, you know, at least do better in some of the upstate areas that surround Greenville and Spartanburg counties. And so, you know, I do think there is a path for Jamie Harrison, but it's going to be a challenge. And again, it's the underlying fundamentals of the Republican support in South Carolina, and the Republican Party in South Carolina has done a really good job over several decades at, you know, fundraising, having to get out the vote operation, you know, fielding candidates who are compelling and have a lot of experience. And so, again, you know, it didn't just happen overnight. Republicans built this strength starting, you know, back in the time of Carroll Campbell, and have just kind of built on it brick by brick. And so they're a juggernaut in South Carolina. It's still a tall order for Jamie Harrison.
Gotcha there. So, but it's still, would you say it's kind of a wake-up call for both parties when we talk about running statewide at this point? I mean, to have such incredible numbers, this must give Democrats hope who, you know, they're seeing this money raised that, you know, I'm sure some of it's making its way back into Democratic Party coffers, so they'll be able to have a little bit more realistic attempts in the future at some of these statewide offices. But also for Republicans thinking, hey, you know, where's this coming from? This is a possibility that, you know, a statewide office is up for grabs for the first time in a long time.
Yeah, definitely a wake-up call for Republicans. They don't have it completely in the bag. And yeah, I think a good sign for Democrats. You know, we've had some good candidates run before statewide on the Democratic ticket, but, you know, no one's been able to raise the type of money. And this is good for South Carolina. I mean, I think that you don't want one party to be in complete control, to have no accountability. I mean, you know, we think about the old South with the Democrats. They dominated. There was no challenge to the Democratic Party. The only race was really in the Democratic primary. You know, now, you know, and since the 2000s, it's really been very unlikely for a Democrat to win. Republicans kind of have it in the bag in many statewide, you know, most of the statewide contests. And so it's good for democracy, that small d democracy, when we have competitive elections. I think it holds whoever's in office a little more accountable.
And Gibbs, we have about 2 minutes left, but I want to just touch on what you were mentioning about some congressional district races too. We're looking at the 1st congressional district there. Republicans obviously had a target on Joe Cunningham's back there since day one after he won election there in 2018. But we're seeing some polling from, you know, the DCCC's, you know, independent expenditure arm showing that he has a 13% margin over Nancy Mace. You know, obviously this is, you know, a paid for poll, but it's kind of interesting to see just a big margin there. And then you also look at the 2nd congressional district here, where you have Adair Ford Burrows, who's running against Joe Wilson in the 2nd district, who just raised, $913,000 in the 3rd quarter, which, you know, is a pretty big sum. It was a record-breaking sum for her, and, you know, she's raised over $2 million in this cycle. So it's interesting to see these pockets of Democrats kind of really giving these Republicans and this majority a run for their money.
Yeah, I mean, so 5 of 7 of the current House members are Republican. And so, Joe Cunningham has had a target on his back. Nancy Mason, in a lot of ways, is a dream candidate. First woman to graduate from the Corps of Cadets at the Citadel, a sitting state, sitting member of the South Carolina House of Representatives. And so certainly a compelling candidate. It's a district that Donald Trump won by 13 percentage points back in 2016. But again, Joe Cunningham is a good candidate for this district. He's, spoken out against Pelosi, spoken about against this party, tried to reach across the aisle, tried to, bill himself as somebody who, it's low country over a party is his campaign theme. And so I doubt that it will be that much of a victory. It was just extremely close back in 2018. But again, things are looking good for Joe Cunningham right now. And I think it's a tribute to the strong campaign that he's run and his ability to raise money.
Yeah, a lot to watch for in the less than 3 weeks to go for Election Day. And Gibbs, you're going to be joining us on Election Night too, so I'm looking forward to that for our Election Night coverage on November 3rd. And that's Gibbs Knotts. He's a political science professor at the College of Charleston. Gibbs, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Gavin.
To stay up to date on the latest news throughout the week, check out the South Carolina Lead. It's a podcast that I host and drops multiple times a week. You can find it on southcarolinapublicradio.org or wherever you find podcasts. For South Carolina ETV, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.